Harry, as we come to chapter 4 of Paul's letter, he still talks about veiling and about the veiled word, about the veil over the eyes of those who believe. What's going on here? Is this a continuation? Is this a reversion to his defensiveness? What's going on?
Yeah, he starts out on kind of a defensive note, and he twists the image a little bit. It's interesting to see how Paul manipulates the imagery all the way through. In the previous chapter, he had begun with the veil on Moses' face when he came down from Mount Sinai, and I think he had in mind also the liturgical practice of Jews covering their heads with a shalit. Yeah. And here, I think he's saying the people who don't agree with me have a veil over there.
They're veiled people. Yeah.
So some of the polemical elements have been twisted a little bit here. But in any case, he wants to not focus on the polemics. He wants to focus on the positive side of what the gospel is that he is preaching. And so the first section of chapter 4 is the gospel that informs his ministry. This is all about his ministry, right? And the gospel is the gospel of light, Jesus Christ, as he says in verse 5, who is the light that God has made shine out of the darkness. An allusion here to Genesis, the same allusion that we find in the opening of the Gospel of John.
Yeah, interesting that they both come at that point to this claim.
Right, Jesus as the light of the world. And here, it's Jesus who has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. Here he's picking up that image of being transformed into identity in some way with Jesus and relationship with God that he had used under the rubric of the mirror at the end of the previous chapter. So these images keep coming back.
And Christ's glory and our glory.
That's right, coming back with a little twist, a kind of a spiraling effect
kind of a spiraling effect,
the argument. So, he wants to celebrate his ministry and his gospel, which he sees as a gospel of light and transformation.
So then he moves from that, I take it to what's mostly, you tell me what it's about, the common clay pot, which is a great sermon illustration in about 1,000 ways. What's he doing with it?
Right. Well, so he focuses, first of all, on the message and then on the messenger.
Okay.
And now he's talking about himself.
Yeah.
So this very positive gospel, the gospel that has to do with the reconciliation that he's effected in chapter 1 and that he celebrates in terms of consolation in chapter 1, this message is in the hands of people like himself who are subject to failure. I think that's the cash value of the image. But it's worth thinking about that image a little bit more. We have this treasure in clay jars. What does he have in mind? My hunch is that he has in mind something else from the procession, which is the image with which he started all of this. We talked about the mirror as perhaps connected with that. I think what he's talking about here is a clay lamp.
Okay.
So we think of jar and we think of a big stand-up thing holding wine or oil or something. I think he's thinking of a little lamp.
Okay.
And why that's relevant is because on many lamps, clay lamps that you have in antiquity, there are images stamped on them. Images often of gods, faces of gods, or little bas-reliefs of deities. And so Paul is frequently talking about the way in which the image of Christ is stamped onto his very being, particularly his being in suffering. He keeps coming back to that as part of the one of the threads of this long discourse. And so I think the image he has in mind here of the clay jar is precisely that. Something that holds the oil that gives the light, right? But itself is very fragile. But insofar as it has any value at all, it's because it has stamped on it that image of Christ.
Good.
Okay?
Yeah.
So I think that's what
that's
he's
powerful.
doing.
And then he goes on with this kind of catalog of the various ways in which he's fragile. The marks of fragility, the afflicted and persecuted.
Right.
I noticed that here, unlike that kind of angry letter we began with, it's almost always first person plural, we this, we that. Is there anything to that, or is this just a rhetorical device?
Well, it's
self-referential.
It's self-referential, all right, but one of the main points he's driving home throughout here is his solidarity with the Corinthians. A solidarity that he wants to reinforce by this letter. And he wants to insist that whatever he has experienced, they have experienced too, And in their very weakness, their experience is the experience of God in Christ,
Nice.
who is made strong in his weakness. That verse from chapter 13 that we saw.
Yeah. Well, and maybe implicitly contrasting himself with the super apostles. The super apostle doesn't sound like somebody who walks in and says, "Let me tell you how weak I am." Right? There's no way of knowing for sure what they said, but I suspect a list of their hazards was not high on the list.
Right.
All right, so then we go on from there to talk about the promise of what Jesus is going to do for the believers over the long haul, for the faithful over the long haul, both for Paul and for the others. Lord will raise us also with Jesus, will bring you into his presence. How do you, what?
No, they bring us with you.
No,
Again,
it's your point
solidarity.
exactly. No,
Yeah.
it's exactly. No, yeah, I should say that more loudly. Us with you. So here we have again what we so often have in Paul, which is a kind of, the classic word is eschatology. What happens at the end of time? What happens to believers? What happens to the world? Why does he draw this in at this point, and what's he claiming, do you think?
Well, a very important part of his gospel message as a whole is hope.
Yeah.
And it's not simply about relationship now, but it's about relationship that's grounded in Christ and consumed in Christ. A relationship that will continue beyond death. Paul believes very strongly in the resurrection. Remember 1 Corinthians 15. If Christ has not been raised from the dead, then our gospel is in vain.
It's silly, right?
So he wants to insist on that. And I think by calling attention to that hope which he shares with the Corinthians, he's trying once again to consolidate the relationship and say, we're in this together and we're in it for the long haul. And that glory into which we're being transformed by having the image of Christ reflected in us is something that's going to reach its consummation beyond death.
Okay. What about the language about outer nature wasting away inner nature? Is that the human condition? Is that Paul's condition? Is that kind of another poetic rhetorical flourish we shouldn't push too hard?
Yeah, well, it's certainly a rhetorical flourish. Paul, one of the things that goes on in these chapters of 2 Corinthians is the constant use of antithesis as a rhetorical device. In, out, up, down, new, old.
Not this, but that.
Right, right. So Paul has a long list of them, and it's a rhetorical technique, all right. And the inner-outer division is something that's going to come back when he talks about the tent in the next chapter, etc. And I think he's called attention to his suffering in the previous paragraph in chapter 4, verses 7 and following, as he does so many times in 2 Corinthians. But he's saying, look, that's not the end of the story. There is something more, there's something deeper. It's my relationship with Christ that you share, and that gives us hope.
So it's that faith, hope, and love abide.
I think so.
And these are going to abide.
And talks about this slight momentary affliction, preparing us for the eternal weight of glory. Glory now understood not, not as something luminous, but as something heavy like gold or something.
C.S. Lewis one time said on spirit that we shouldn't think of it as lighter than air, but heavier. That the heaviest thing we have is spirit. In this case, glory is the heaviest.
I wonder if there's yet another allusion to something going on in a religious triumph. That is gold baubles and jewelry, which have weight to it and also shine, right?
And we have an even better weight. We have
That's right.
Yet more glorious, yet more and enduring.
Yep.
Very good. Thank you.